Good afternoon and welcome. I am Tamara Bond-Williams. I'm the Membership Director for SSPI, Space and Satellite Professionals International, and we are pleased to welcome you to the 2021 series of the New York Space Business Roundtable, presented by SSPI's Northeast Chapter and the New York Space Business Roundtable. A little bit of housekeeping. All but the speakers are muted, but the chat box is open for questions and reflections as we go through today's session. We will have a dedicated question and answer period immediately following the session for anyone who wishes to stay on. And so if your questions are in the chat, we'll hope to get to them. We're going to go ahead and kick off today's session with a timely and relevant video from the SSPI Better Satellite World campaign. And that video is called Footing the Climate Bill for the World.
The vast forests of the tropics are givers of life. 80% of the Earth's land animals and plants live there, and more than 250 million of the world's poorest people make their livings from the forest. Forests matter. The trees of the Amazon produce 1/5 of the oxygen we breathe. All the world's forests keep more than 200 billion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. But every year, fire, bulldozers, and lumber crews clear millions of hectares of forests, an area bigger than New Zealand. In just the last 40 years, the world has lost a forest area equal in size to all of Europe. Stopping deforestation is hard. The poor people most affected by it have little power to change things. Much of it breaks national laws, but overstretched governments struggle to stop it. One nation, however, stands out. The government of Norway is the first to fund programs that help tropical nations rein in deforestation. A grant to Brazil in 2008 helped preserve enough forest to keep 3 billion tons of carbon out of the air. A 2010 agreement with Indonesia offered incentive payments for reducing emissions, and that nation's carbon output dropped by half in just a few years. In 2020, Norway took another step. It announced a first-of-its-kind public-private partnership with Planet, Airbus and KSAT. Together, they would provide access to detailed satellite imagery covering 64 countries, all for free. Planet operates a vast fleet of small satellites called Doves. They take pictures of all the Earth's landmass every day. Those pictures are detailed enough to reveal individual trees. Airbus is adding an archive of images captured by its Spot satellites since 2002. These allow today's forests to be compared to those from years ago. The Norwegian company KSAT is pulling together all this data and providing technical support to users who can view and download the files from Global Forest Watch or Planet. With daily updates from space, the images offer the first chance to see deforestation while it is happening. Logging and land clearing operations deep in the forest can no longer hide. Governments and international organizations can identify illegal actors and pressure them to change. And all this value comes free of charge because the Norwegian government is paying for the service. For the founders of Planet, this effort is the realization of a dream. When CEO Will Marshall, Chief Strategy Officer Robbie Schingler, and Chris Boshausen left NASA to found the company, their goal was to provide actionable data on the whole planet at the speed of change. This lets governments, businesses, and researchers make smarter, more informed decisions to better protect our world's ecosystems. For Norway, the images show its forest funding at work. As the government's Minister of Climate and Environment told the BBC, we decided to foot the bill for the world. So, the next time you take a deep breath, thank Norway and the images and technology that come from companies like Planet, Airbus and KSAT. Together, they are helping keep the life-giving forests of the world alive. Space and satellite, the world's invisible, indispensable technologies. Brought to you by Space and Satellite Professionals International.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Tamara, for starting us off today with that video. The question, what else are we doing? What else are you doing to make a better satellite world, and how can we all prosper from it? Can we? And what does prospering mean in a time when we are also seeking, often desperately, a new sense of unity and fulfillment as a species? Those are really big questions, but we think this is a moment when they need to be asked. And so as we approach this, we decided that SSPI and New York Space Alliance should revive both the SSPI Northeast chapter and the New York Business Roundtable to have that discussion. So who is SSPI? Well, many of you know us, many of you are members. We are the world's oldest and largest nonprofit trade association for satellite and space industry professionals around the world. Anybody that works in this industry and touches this industry, has an interest in this industry, is considered a member of our community. And today, we are delighted to be in New York to start this important dialogue. It will be a new series of discussions, one every third Wednesday, and it will be a deep dive into a subject that relates to the business of space, but also to the business of our collective experience and our desire to make a better world. Because SSPI has determined that by making a better world, we make a better business community. And among all industries, we are the one that can do it, and we do it every second of the day, as you just observed. Before we start, and I turn it over to my partner, I wanted to offer a special thanks to the Luxembourg Trade and Investment Office for their support for this series. Also, our media partner for the 2021 series, which is Space News. Additional support is being provided by the Washington Space Business Roundtable and World Teleport Association. As I mentioned, SSPI is partnering with the New York Space Alliance, who many of you know. New York Space Alliance launched this New York Space Business Roundtable, and as I said, we are pleased to be working with them to bring it back and to launch it again. Joe Fargnoli is the key guy. He's not only someone who grew up in Rochester, where I grew up, so we have an immediate kindred spirit, but we also have thought this through, and we think that what we're going to be presenting to you will be both exciting, informative, and good for your business or your enterprise. Joe, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Lou. Yeah, as Lou mentioned, we decided to bring the roundtable back with the topic of ESG, which we consider to be a reset opportunity in the framework of thought in the industry. Because one of the things that we really like about our astropreneurs is that there's a strong sense of wanting to apply principles to improve the social and economic life for all of Earth's inhabitants. Underlying the idea of ESG, we see the impetus being a greater realization of the foundational principle of the reality of the oneness of humanity, along with all of its ramifications, and that the advancement of the dynamic coherence between the material world and that of aspirations of the human spirit can and needs to lead to a disinterested service to the cause of humanity, and that efforts to use space to engage in social action are given a vital impetus by principle-based information sessions such as what we're offering here to produce a commitment to transformation resulting in community building and advancement in culture. The Space Business Roundtable seeks to encourage a process of action, reflection, and consultation, which we hope will lead to the stirrings of social action by helping to advance their critical capacity to apply ESG principles with science and engineering to the manifold dimensions of social existence and to reading and addressing social reality as we collectively seek to address the overemphasis on material things and self-centeredness, which inhibits our ability to work together as a global community. I think that we all seek the honor and distinction of using space entrepreneurship to become a source of social good. We're at the beginning of the new space movement, and we're starting to see a set of voluntary principles incorporating ESG issues move into institutional investment decision-making. Groups like the UN's Principles of Responsible Investment, unpri.org, and Europe's Sustainable Investment Fora, eurosif.org. They define a philosophy with the term of sustainable and responsible investment, SRI. Our goal is to help the community decide the best path to implement these worthy concepts in light of their business reality. Neither SSPI nor NYSA desire to push an agenda here, nor will we allow one to be pushed on our collaborators. What we want is to create a sensible, non-political, non-jargon-laden, open and frank New York-style conversation where we explore these topics together and co-generate a framework that can help this community advance along these worthy lines. We hope that this session is something of a combination of Saturday Night Live and Crossfire, open, enjoyable, yet dedicated to addressing the deeper realities that will shift entire societies, industries, nations, and the shared destiny of mankind. With that, we have lined up a bench deep with experts today. I first want to introduce Mr. Peter Fusaro. He's a senior partner with ESG Oxford Global Accelerated Ventures. He's also a partner in Connective Earth, and he's the founder of the Wall Street Green Summit that goes all the way back to 2002. And he's founder and chairman of Global Chains Associates, which goes back to 1991. Peter has a lot of experience in this field, and he's also a grad of Carnegie Mellon and Tufts. I'd also like to introduce Hoyt Davidson. He's the founder and managing partner for Near Earth LLC. He's been doing that since 2002. He's well known as the go-to guy for new space financing. Hoyt is a grad of MIT in both physics and finance. Great combination. Harriet Brettel is the head of business analysis at Astroscale. She's leading analysis and development of Astroscale's business case for commercial and institutional debris removal service and is the chair of the Space Generation Advisory Council. She holds a master's in planetary science from Caltech. Jason Rainbow, our moderator today, is the senior staff writer at Space News, focusing on satellite telecom, finance, and commercial markets, and has spent more than a decade covering the global space industry as a business journalist. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jason Rainbow, who will be our moderator for today's session.
Thank you, Joe. And hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel today on a topic that has huge implications for the space industry and every single industry around the world. It's a massive, sprawling topic that has, well, it's not short of hype. So one of the things that I hope to achieve today is to put all this into tangible, real terms. And I'm lucky to be surrounded by experts coming at ESG with different perspectives to help do this. But firstly, before we get into our discussion about the impact of ESG today and what's on the near horizon, I want to just lay out what it is exactly that we're talking about today. So ESG stands for Environment, Social and Governance. Essentially, it's a collection of non-financial criteria that companies are increasingly adding to their financial statements, where they also record revenues and profits. And they can cover anything from how much pollution they emit to how they treat animals. And the idea is to visibly track what a company is doing in the E, S, and G to help them set goals for the future and to be held accountable for those targets. So for instance, a manufacturer might make a commitment to use less water. And so every 3 months or so, they'll choose to disclose how much water they use for that period, progress they've made towards reaching that goal, or something like that, as they update investors on their financial performance. Why are they doing this? Well, there's a general trend favoring businesses that are more responsible for their impact on humanity. Customers are starting to care about this more, and importantly, investors and shareholders are as well. BlackRock, which is the largest fund manager in the world and oversees something like $9 trillion of assets, famously said last year that it would base all of its decisions on ESG criteria. So there's been this voluntary movement towards this, as well as hints that mandatory ESG disclosures could start to come into play in countries like the US. And all of this has gotten the space industry very excited because satellites are great for providing a lot of the insights that companies need to get a handle on their ESG situation and also how to improve those metrics going forward. Now, importantly, it's important to note here that this is still in very early stages. There are competing standards for ESG, for instance, and within ESG, there are also different layers of complexity called scopes. So when it comes to tracking greenhouse gases, for example, scope 1 would cover direct emissions from a company's own facilities, whereas scope 2 relates to its energy consumption. So what proportion of that comes from renewable versus non-renewable sources. And then scope 3 goes into even more depth because it takes into account a company's supply chain and what they're doing, bringing what materials a business buys under the lens. So a company that decides to start including ESG may only cover a certain scope, and that just adds to the challenge of trying to compare and contrast how different companies are performing as it relates to ESG. But as ESG becomes increasingly popular, many say it will not just be about driving revenue, but also survivability as a business as well. So that's my table setter. I'm going to turn now to the experts for their views. And please do also send us your questions for them through the chat box on here. And I'll do my best to weave them in as I go along, but we're also going to be reserving time at the end of the discussion to catch anything that I couldn't get to. Right, so Peter, let's start with you. I think it's fair to say you're on the cutting edge here as it relates to not only the innovation looking to take advantage of this trend, but also the current appetite from investors. What are some of the latest applications you've come across as it relates to ESG? And you might still be muted. The classic mistake there. There you go.
I'm back. Yeah, I thought it'd be helpful to talk about the market a little bit first. I'm a senior partner for Oxford Global Accelerated Ventures. We partner with Oxford University, Harvard University, Stanford University to commercialize intellectual property in 30 months. We're not doing A, B, C, D round. We're actually raising capital on the back end and moving product into the market a lot faster. For example, faster growing rice with twice the yield, half as much water. Synthetic palm oil is another one of our things. We're also very deeply involved in carbon markets, which I've been involved in 20 years. So I think you should look at ESG today as the beginning of a market. I have gone through 4 market cycles. There's just too much hype on the market size being 17 or $30 trillion. That's nonsense. This is a smaller market where funds are starting to move into decarbonization of portfolios to the energy transition. And the attraction is there are more investors than there are product. So my estimate of market size is $100 billion. I'm looking at direct investment, solar, wind, and other renewables. For example, BlackRock threw $4 billion in April, Carlyle Group 4.2 billion in March. It's not as big as you think because when you're making a business transformation, it takes time. So right now, it is very favorable to talk about all these things, particularly since this is Climate Week in New York, and everybody is focused on this, but it's the beginning of a market. It grew out of socially responsible investing and now is pivoted into sustainability. So as Jason said, ESG means environmental, social, governance. The E is probably the easiest to measure because we're looking at air emissions, water quality, things that are impacted by climate change. The S, social factors, are targeted more to societal impacts in the community. And the governance means a more need to transparency in business operations. This is data-driven, and the data, to be very honest, is very poor. Right now, we're, as I said, beginning of the market, these metrics offer an opportunity, in my opinion, for the space industry to collect data for sustainable outcomes. So ESG reporting, not yet mandated, but starting to go there with the SEC, taking a serious look at monitoring and disclosing ESG targets. Corporates are now measuring climate change risk on their balance sheet. We're going to see a massive amount of buying in carbon offsets this decade because, frankly, we're short carbon offsets and long emissions. So for public companies, there are many subscription services such as MSCI, RepRisk, Sustainalytics. They sell subscriptions, but that's 10% of the market. Where I sit, I'm in the private sector, private markets, 90% of the markets. Frankly, right now, a half a dozen software vendors are scoring portfolios for private equity funds. It's a good thing, and that's their focus. They're getting a lot of traction. Another area we're going to see this move faster is carbon accounting. There's a lot of software solutions today to look at management of your portfolio and what your carbon intensity is. And here's the other problem. There are 57 metrics for ESG. This is not how markets operate. Operating markets work in simplicity for replication of trade. So right now, we need standardization, not happening yet. We have something called the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board that Mayor Bloomberg proposed. Very good idea, but it's still in its infancy. So beginning of market, ripe with opportunity. Green bonds are an analogous market, small market. Global debt is $100 trillion. Green bonds is a little over 1% of that. Last year was $270 billion. This year, estimates are between $360 to $720 billion. So still about 1.25% of the market. So where we really need to take this is to the space industry. This is looking at nature on the balance sheet. As a friend of mine called it, eyes in the sky. So satellites for GPS, LiDAR, drones. We're very involved with biodiversity and sustainable forestry. We're using drones. There are even little dots you can put on trees to each tree, frankly, to measure and monitor its growth. So today, nature is now becoming financialized. That's a big deal. And at Oxford, we look at biodiversity credits and something called blue carbon, which you've probably never heard of, which is kelp beds, mangroves, et cetera, things from the water. And the bigger issue is REDD+, which is carbon coming from deforestation, afforestation. What the video really showed you in a very pictorial way is that 41% of carbon offsets in the last 5 years have come from forestry offsets, and that's growing. We're looking at larger stands of trees. Just for your information, Russia has 20% of the world's forestry. As far as we know, there hasn't been one forestry project done in Russia yet. That's a big deal because most people look at Latin America, Brazil, Amazonian, Bolivia, and Peru, Southeast Asia, but there are forests around the world, the lungs of the earth. So that's an important thing to look at. Deforestation, afforestation, measuring, monitoring, and verifying. Carbon accounting, as I mentioned before, same thing. You've got to monitor and verify the emissions, and there are very credible third-party sources for verification. That's so you don't have any double counting. I see a big opportunity in supply chain from space, specifically the shipping and airline industries. I briefed the airline carriers about 10 years ago on greenhouse gases. Their technology cycles are 40 years. So they can get a bump of 25% in fuel economy. And I know everybody's talking about biofuels for jet fuel. Good luck on that one. The reality is you have to have lubricity, things have to work. So airlines, shipping, part of the global supply chain need to be greened up, and that's going to be done by carbon offsetting. Agriculture, under stress from climate, but also it's important for space technology. Look at crop growing and monitoring there. We're losing a lot of soil and around the world. That's a big depletion area. And even more precise weather forecasting. So I look at the space industry today and ESG going hand in hand. You're looking at the three world's largest businesses: energy, food, and water. Energy, a $6 trillion business, food, a $5 trillion business, water industry, a $3 trillion business. It's going to go through a business transformation, but it needs to have monitoring, verification, and monetization of carbon, which is the commodity we're really talking about. And frankly, in my opinion, will be the next large multi-trillion-dollar market. It's small today, but will grow. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a very comprehensive overview. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. As you mentioned, a lack of data is one of the many obstacles that ESG needs to clear to reach the potential of this trend. And data, of course, is a growth market for space. It's something which a lot of companies are gearing themselves toward, and especially space-based data is going to help give a lot of these insights and verify them as well. Hoyt, you've been advising space companies for a number of years. How much of a role is ESG playing in the business plans that you're seeing from space companies today, and how has that changed?
I would say what I'm seeing most recently is the realization among these entrepreneurs, or astropreneurs as Joe likes to call them, is that there is this natural alliance between the ESG movement and the space movement. They're mostly about rolling out new technologies and capabilities to open up new commercial markets for services from space, primarily to serve people on the Earth, including data and climate information, telecommunications. But I think most of at least the smart entrepreneurs are starting to realize that part of their story to investors is that they are going to create this positive impact on Earth that's going to make everyone's lives better. So increasingly, that's becoming an important part of the marketing materials, the information memorandums, and the conversations with investors. And I would add, at the same time, I think every year we see more and more venture capital firms, even in some cases private equity firms, starting to include as one of their, what they look for investment, this positive impact on society or the Earth. So I think it's all still very early stage. And I think because of that, the space movement should be kind of a kindred spirit to the ESG movement, and they should link and grow together. They both have enormous opportunities. They're both kind of at a fledgling stage, finding their feet, but they're just natural allies, natural partners. And I think that's going to become more and more apparent to investors and operators and individuals as time goes on.
And Harriet, you're coming at this from an interesting perspective. Space, we've been hearing, has a big role to play in helping facilitate ESG solutions, but satellite companies themselves could also have some unique ESG commitments to make too. I know Astroscale has done a lot of work raising awareness around the issue of space sustainability and what satellite operators can and should be doing to improve this. Can you tell us what you're doing on that policy front, and what's the reception been like from governments and businesses around the world?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jason. And it's a real pleasure to be on this panel today. I think we've got some really complementary views to bring to this discussion. So from my perspective, I just want to really reinforce what Peter and Hoyt have said in terms of, firstly, the value that space companies and satellite technologies can bring in order for companies on Earth to be able to monitor and enforce ESG objectives. There's a huge opportunity there. And as Hoyt was saying, this is something that's going to grow over time. And there's a real opportunity for space companies to demonstrate that value to investors, to wider stakeholders, and really cement the role of the space community within that wider ecosystem, which I think is going to be really important. One of the things that it's really important to recognize is that those valuable services that space companies are providing here on Earth, is reliant on the sustainable use of the environment that they're using in and of themselves, right? So we have thousands of satellites in orbit around the Earth right now, providing a whole host of services, whether that's related to ESG objectives or otherwise. It could be telecommunications, Earth observation, you name it. There's a whole host of things that satellites can do. But that orbital environment itself is becoming increasingly congested and unsustainable in the use of that environment as well. And so when we think about sustainability, we really need to think about that holistically and think about the orbital environment there as well. So it's fantastic to see space companies advocating for how they can support other companies with their own ESG perspectives and objectives. And when we're doing that, we also need to think about that space environment too. So really kind of closing the loop on what it means to be a truly sustainable company, and kind of looking at all of those angles together.
Yeah, we're here now talking about ESG after big global conversations about sustainability on Earth that have been taking place for decades. Are conversations and the activity for the space environment lagging those, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'd really defer to Peter and Hoyt on their expertise in terms of how we've seen that environmental discussion evolve on Earth when we think about greater awareness around climate change, around environmental issues, and also, moving towards end users, really taking awareness and driving action there as well as private companies taking on that responsibility themselves, potentially before there is that government mandate to really step up, right? So we've definitely seen, I think, a huge amount of progress on the earthbound side. And it feels a little bit like now that the space society and the space ecosystem is kind of waking up to these issues as well. We have increasing awareness around the growing threat of space debris in orbit, the operational burden that comes with navigating this increasingly congested environment. And the really important thing to highlight there is that the issues that we're seeing in space are not new. They are very similar to some of the challenges that we face in Earth. And so if we can't learn those lessons from other sectors, we're really falling short of the potential of the satellite industry.
And Peter, we're seeing a growing number of companies starting to record ESG metrics and targets. Boeing, it's a huge aerospace and defense company, recently published its first sustainability report. But as you mentioned, this is all still voluntary. Do you see regulations with teeth coming down the line?
Yeah, under the Biden administration, I see this coming out of the SEC. Yes, most corporations have sustainability reports. The trouble is, a lot of it's garbage in, garbage out. What are they actually monitoring, verifying, and showing? So I think, as I mentioned, we don't have those metrics. Almost 2 years ago, I spoke with the CFA Society here in New York and suggested that the data collectors, the vendors, work together for common standards. Well, you can see where that went. They're making a lot of money selling subscriptions. I'm going to be very blunt. And the software companies are making a lot of money selling to the 7,000 private equity funds in the United States. That's not how you build metrics, standardization, whatever. Last year, the SEC started talking about ESG. I thought they were going to strangle the market. This is the beginning of a market. And financial reporting is very important. But the better news is that Fortune 1000 now have to have climate change risk on the balance sheet. And that has to be measured by third-party verification companies. Exxon is now doing this. They announced this a few weeks ago in the Permian Basin. Methane leaks are a problem. Methane, natural gas, has 22 times the carbon intensity of carbon dioxide. So that's a big problem for the energy industry. And this falls a lot on the energy industry. But we're using fossil fuels. People talk about net zero by 2050. Good luck on that one. That ain't going to happen. We're still going to be using fossil energy. I worked on the Prius with Toyota in 1997, 98. That runs on gasoline. However, we got a bump in fuel economy, less emissions. So you have to look a little more holistically about how this is all going to occur. Government has a role, but I don't see a carbon regime for government. I've worked on the California AB 32 implementation, the climate change law in California. California at that time was the 9th largest economy in the world. It's now the 5th largest economy in the world. They've already adapted to climate change. They've created new industries. This is not a heavy lift for the US. Problem is, it's going to cost too much. Look, when I was 25 years old, I helped get the lead out of gasoline with EPA, and the industry came to me and says, well, we can't afford to do this. Well, that's not true. Engineers solve problems. Engineers figured out how to take lead out of gasoline, which boosted octane numbers, and they did it without any gasoline shortages. So my attitude is, being a former policymaker under 3 presidents, set the rules and let industry innovate. Don't get into the minutia. Don't pick technology winners. It's a really bad idea for government, but let the rules set the stage. That's what I think the Biden people are doing. John Kerry was on the tube this morning. They're going to do this with federal agencies. That could be a model for industry. And I'll just be very blunt. Those that lag are going to pay the piper at the end of this decade, because there will be a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases. Maybe it's statewide, maybe it's federal. I'm not too excited about the Paris Accord because it's aspirational and no teeth. There's no market incentives. There's no pricing for carbon. By the way, there are 64 carbon regimes in the globe today. Some are cap and trade. We're trading emissions. Some are carbon taxes. This is not the way to run this, but it is what it is. And we have a greenhouse gas footprint of 38 billion metric tons of carbon today. And I've been working on climate change for 31 years, and it goes up every year. That's the problem.
As for the size of the market that you see for ESG, do you think that there will need to be mandatory ESG disclosures to achieve that? Or is there enough momentum in the commercial marketplace that this is just an inevitability at this point?
Well, as I mentioned, only 10% of the market are public companies. There are half as many public companies in the United States than there were 25 years ago. So just do the math. It's private companies we got to work on. And right now, it's a handful of software vendors. They're very good, by the way. Some are doing carbon management. Some are doing stress testing on portfolio, et cetera. But yes, the SEC has to set rules for reporting. It's financial disclosure. This is a risk on the balance sheet.
If I may, I just wanted to touch on something that Peter just said in terms of that, counterfactual of we can't afford to do this, right? That resistance to change, and just kind of touching on that from the space perspective, that the counter to that I'd say is, we can't afford not to, right? And so there is this inherent cost that is associated with making changes in how businesses operate and how that works. But there are also costs associated with not making those changes and not adapting to that evolving environment. And so I think what's really important for us to advocate for here, and I can speak to this at least on the space side, is understanding what are those indirect or less obvious costs that companies are incurring by not identifying and addressing these risks now, because it is very much, you pay now to mitigate, or you pay a lot later down the line more to address a bigger problem.
Jason, can I add to that?
Please.
I think the wonderful opportunity for the space community is, unlike many industries, this is not a risk. This is not something they should be dragged into doing. It's something that they should want to do because it's a plus for them. It's an advantage. And I mean, many commercial space companies, they are doing things that will benefit society, humanity, whether it's ubiquitous 24/7 broadband communication, data applications for everything, a climate. But again, looking at our sort of natural alliance, I don't know of any satellites that run on fossil fuel, right? They're all solar energy powered. And the satellite industry is desperate to try to get more and more efficient solar energy and bigger panels. to support bigger infrastructure, space stations, lunar settlements, whatever. So there's a natural, tendency to want to do things more sustainably in space because you have to. We're talking about the food industry. If you're on the moon or Mars or a space station and you have to grow all the food, you don't want to ship a head of lettuce from the earth. You've got to grow it there. So all of the really cool hydroponics and aquaponics research that I've seen recently is about doing it in space, where you truly have to solve the problems. And once you do, you can bring that sustainable technology, the agriculture technology, back to Earth through vertical farming or more sustainable farming. So again, we're natural allies on energy. We want safe nuclear or fusion energy because you have to have that for deep space exploration. We want it for food, sustainable food, even water. I mean, some of the most interesting business plans I've seen recently are remote sensing constellations totally focused on the water cycle. Where's the water? How is it moving? Because water is, as Peter said, going to be a huge, industry going forward. So again, the alignment is just so perfect with ESG and the space community. We just got to tell people they should start telling their positive stories, right?
I want to add, I'm on the advisory board of a company in Columbus, Ohio, that NASA is funding to make water on the moon. It's called Power to Hydrogen. Mm-hmm. And it's still early stage, but NASA sees the need to find water on planets.
Yeah.
Peter, actually, before we move on, I just want to, you touched on something interesting earlier, something of a disconnect out there. I mean, there's obviously a lot of opportunities, as Hoyt was talking about, and Harriet. But, you were saying how you've been crunching the numbers, and you're saying, well, it's not exactly, we're not talking about trillions and trillions of dollars at this point. It's something like $100 billion, although it is growing rapidly. As always, with big, flashy opportunities that promise to be extremely lucrative, there's going to be risks for investors. What are they for ESG? Where are people getting carried away?
I don't think they're getting too carried away. I just think there's a lot of hype in the market. And as I mentioned, not enough product. What am I talking about? Funds. There aren't that many ESG specific funds. There's, in Europe, they actually took $2 trillion out of these so-called ESG compliant funds because they called it greenwashing. So that's what I'm saying. If this thing didn't exist before, how could they possibly be ESG compliant? It's nonsense. I mean, as I mentioned, decarbonization, the energy trend, you're going to hear a lot about that. It takes time to do all these things. I've worked on projects that took years. You think the Prius was fast? We had cars we smashed up, literally smashed up. And I also worked on fuel cell vehicles that run on hydrogen. So what I'm getting at is this is the beginning of a transition to a market. The metrics, though, are going to be big data and AI. And that's where I see the synergy with the space industry. So what we're doing is some forestry projects in different locales. We're going to be using LiDAR. We're going to be using drones. We're going to be looking at the data. I mean, I'm not an expert on trees, but I understand something about forestry. And, you're looking at this is a big deal because forestry is really what's constraining a larger greenhouse gas footprint. And it's very sad to see these forest fires all over the world, Siberia, Greece, Australia, the West Coast, because that is taking more carbon into the atmosphere. Otherwise, our carbon footprint would be 52 billion tons, not 38. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of there. But as I said, markets are sloppy when they get started. There's pricings all over the place. I've seen Stripe, the payment thing, pay $1,000 a ton for carbon capture and storage, which is ridiculous, but they don't know much. And it's Stripe, how much carbon are they really using? When people talk about their carbon footprint, it's not material. If you're a server farm or Microsoft or Google, you don't have much of a carbon footprint. Server farms are 2% of energy demand in the US. That will rise to 8% by 2030. You're really talking about energy intensive, particularly fossil energy intensive industries. We've reduced our carbon footprint in this country because we've closed coal plants in a very major way. Coal used to be 55% of base load capacity. It's now less than 25.
Okay, something that could help accelerate this trend and kick the sluggish companies when they need to be kicked is, of course, regulation and mandatory ESG disclosures. How does the panel think something like that could be enforced? Will there need to be some sort of international watchdog to verify the information that they produce? Who wants to take that one on?
Well, that's what SASB is about. Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. There are international treaty. There is a whole task force in London working on the voluntary markets. As I mentioned, the Paris Accord, great aspirationally, does not have any carbon pricing in it. It's totally silly because you have to have those metrics to measure, monitor, verify, and reduce. So, there won't be another Kyoto Protocol treaty where 194 nations signed it and actually didn't get the job done. EU, 28 countries, they're getting the job done. The emissions trading scheme is working. So I actually look at regional markets. I think there'll be a North American market, Mexico, US, Canada, just like NAFTA. That's how I see things evolving. And as I mentioned before, there are 64 carbon markets. New York has a carbon market. RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That's not how you do things. It's very confusing to investors. They also like metrics they can understand. And as I mentioned, we're just in the beginning of this market. This is actually a business transformation we've never seen before, because you're going to decarbonize every industry. You're going to see movement into new technologies faster. I think I can make an argument that COVID is going to accelerate a lot of this because it's disrupting industries. And here's the key. Investors are very engaged on this. And there's $40 trillion going to the next gen people. So there's a lot of global wealth moving. And I've dealt with their wealth managers. The young people want to get the job done and they want to kick the tires and see how it's done. So I'm actually very optimistic about all this.
Okay. I want to bring the conversation back to what we're actually seeing in the market today. And Hoyt, maybe you can help us with this. How much of consideration is ESG when a company wants to buy another company at the moment? Let's say a company is doing fairly well on the ESG front, and it's part of its corporate identity, and it's being very loud about it and very visible. But it wants to buy another company for its technology or something like this. If that target company is perhaps a little more careless on the ESG side of things to the point where it would set the acquirer back, how much does that impact its valuation, its price tag?
Well, Jason, I think that's exactly what goes on. I mean, obviously, it's still primarily a financial transaction. The valuation is primarily driven by revenues and cash flows, their competitive position in the market, their growth opportunities, and all of those normal sort of business metrics. But I think increasingly, when you're buying a company, the buyer will look at all of the risk out there. Some might be environmental risk, human resource risk, cyber risk. They'll look at all the different risks, litigation risk, and I think this just falls into that as a new category of risk that they need to understand. Is the company positioned well to eliminate or mitigate those risks? How are they going to look? Really, how are they going to look to this younger community as it grows and pushes ESG to be more and more important? I think for most of the executives and bankers and lawyers that are my age, they're not so much focused on ESG, honestly. Some are, but most aren't. But it's the 20 and 30-year-olds where this is really more of a core sensibility and criteria for them, and everyone realizes that's just going to get larger and larger over time. So yeah, it kind of falls into the risk category of due diligence, and whether or not it ultimately affects the valuation a buyer is willing to pay will depend on the exposure. I think right now, it probably doesn't have much of an impact, but it is an issue and concern that does get considered.
Have you seen companies walk away from a potential deal so they don't get a hit on their ESG scorecard, or are we not there yet?
I wouldn't be surprised if that's happened. I personally don't have an experience of that in any of the transactions I've done. So I don't have any anecdotal evidence, personal anecdotal evidence to share.
Harriet, here's a fun one for you. Do you foresee satellite companies acting as corporate detectives in space, kind of probing into an acquisition target's supply chains and so on, as part of the due diligence process to make sure that that everything is above board and all that?
I mean, yeah, I can't see why not, right? And this really comes back to what Peter was saying earlier in terms of there's no point having a regulation if you can't measure and enforce it, right? So you need to have metrics that you identify, and you need to have a way of monitoring them. And satellite technology and services is a crucial way to be able to do that, right? So you look at the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, for example. I think pretty much every one of those can be monitored from space or using satellite technology. So there's a huge opportunity there for space companies to really be providing those services. And it kind of comes back to what Hoyt was saying in terms of this complementarity, right? There is a market opportunity for satellite companies to be able to offer their services in a way that is providing value to this growing ESG market. If you could say, right, we want to take over this company and we want to be able to validate and verify that they really do have the emissions that they say they do, you could go to a satellite company that is able to monitor that and have that third-party verification. So I think there are definitely opportunities for space to play an important role.
That's interesting. If you're a new age green startup, you're probably already used to dealing with ESG on a very granular level every day. But if you're a big and old legacy company now looking at disclosing all of this, that's a different proposition, isn't it? Where do these companies even start to get a handle on where they sit with ESG? Peter, do you have any?
Well, the first step is carbon accounting, measuring, monitoring, verifying the carbon footprint. And there are software solutions. One is called Persephone, amazing company. Came out of industry, by the way, Occidental Petroleum. They had, I've never seen this before, they had an A round in April and a B round in June. That's how fast they're growing. And they just contacted me today. It's Persephone with an F, not a PH, like Greek mythology. But they are so granular, they can measure the carbon footprint of somebody working at home. And so they're doing that for major corporations. Told me 8 out of the 10 largest private equity funds. So it's already happening. It's a whole new industry that, you're talking writing code and apps. So that's done and growing, and it'll continue. That's the first step. The sustainability reports, they're all over the place. I mean, literally, because you can get into the weeds on diversity, and particularly see a question on developing countries. Are we just exporting pollution? So there are ethical issues here as well. I actually think this is going to be the decade of transparency. When you've got news 24/7 and social media and every kind of app you can imagine, I actually think you can run, but you can't hide anymore. If you're a bad actor, you're going to be penalized in your equity price, and investors are going to shun you. This is not the way it's been before. You're running out of time if you want to be a bad actor.
What about the, I don't know if the right way of saying this is the downside of transparency, but isn't it going to create problems for companies wanting to hide trade secrets, the suppliers they use, how they use them, and things like that? Is that like a material risk to the way companies do business as we move towards everything being more visible and accountable? It's a bit of a tough one.
They don't need to disclose trade secrets. I deal with a lot of companies that don't want government copyright or anything. They secret sauce, Coca-Cola, it's a trade secret. So, the reality is you don't have to disclose that. Okay,
great. Okay, we're actually running out of time here. So I think I just want to I'll ask one quick question to each of you, and we'll start with you, Peter. ESG has become a big buzzword recently, and there's a lot of talk around it. But what are people not talking enough about when it comes to ESG that needs more attention? And I'll ask this to each of you on the panel.
Well, I'm the head of ESG for Oxford Global Accelerated Ventures, and my whole world is everybody's in ESG and impact. So I don't actually think it's a problem, and I actually see this as a transformative, catalytic occurrence. And you can say 2 years ago, it hardly was there, and now it's here.
How about you, Hoyt? Anything that should be more of a discussion point as we talk about ESG?
Yeah, I think the one thing we didn't spend much time on, we talked a lot about kind of the E and the S. The one thing I would mention on the governance side, I think what I've seen over the last decade is for the aerospace industry has been a huge transition from something that was almost entirely dominated by males, and particularly white males, to a much more diverse, senior executive class and boards. And even on the nonprofit side, if you look at for instance, the Space Foundation board that I'm on and the National Space Society board I'm on, one industry group, one a grassroots group. If you look at their boards today versus 10 or 20 years ago, they're very diverse boards. I think there's been this realization in the aerospace industry, and I'm sure other industries, of the importance of having diverse perspectives on the board and in senior management. And that's not just men and women, it's ethnic groups, people of color, having international perspective, having a young perspective. Both those boards I'm on try to have young people as well, and that you can make better decisions if you have more diverse perspectives. And I think 10 years ago, people would say, no, you just get the most qualified person you can, and this total meritocracy and these diversity of perspectives doesn't matter. And I think that's there's more and more realization that diverse perspectives do help you make better decisions. That's the big change that I've seen recently.
And Harriet, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. This has been a really insightful discussion, and I've certainly learned a lot about the ESG side of things from the bigger picture. One thing I just want to kind of reinforce is this, this role that space can play to support other companies in the wider ecosystems, support of their own ESG perspectives and objectives. But that falls flat if the space industry is not thinking about ESG in our own backyard, right? So we need to be thinking about how ESG objectives apply to our own orbital environment in which our satellite services are operating in, and make sure that we're thinking about that holistically and consistently as well.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that's a great point to wrap up this part of the event, and to thank each of you, of course, for fantastic insights into what is quite a convoluted subject. So thank you very much for letting me bombard you with questions all over the place. But please stick around because we're going to get into any questions that we've received from the audience. But for now, thank you very much. I'd like to invite Joe and Lou back to the virtual stage.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jason. And thanks to Harriet and Peter and Hoyt. That was a remarkable conversation, actually. I'm almost sorry we have to stop it, but there will be more of these. Joe, I took a lot of notes. We're at the very beginning of this, was one of them, but the quotes coming out of this were stunning. A mixed bag of approaches, which is perhaps necessary at this stage. But both Hoyt and Harriet noted that standards would be required. Peter, I think, dropped a few great ones on us. Nature is now on the balance sheet. Nature is financialized. This will be the decade of transparency. Hoyt said that space and satellite industry, which is true, is driving a lot of the techniques that we'll use to remediate and make our life better here. This is not a risk, it's an advantage, he said. So I think, again, I think we're off to a good start. Hoyt also said that a younger generation will pick this up. And I have to shout out Harriet. For those of you who follow our Future Leaders program, the entire industry selected Harriet as one of the future leaders for our industry last year. We have a cohort called the 20 under 35. So now you know her age, she's under 35, but she was selected as one of the leaders in our industry. And again, she, I think, spoke very articulately about the ecosystem that's beginning to form as well. Joe, I've got a million questions, but those are some of the things that Jason was able to bring out. What would you pick up from this?
Thanks, Lou. You took really good notes, and Jason, thank you for moderating an excellent session. And I'm really, very pleased that we had this panel of experts looking at this issue. The way Peter said that 2 years ago ESG wasn't there and now it's here really kind of says it all. And that's what we're trying to do in this series. We want to get beyond the bumper stickers and the top level understanding of ESG, and we're going to keep drilling down in the next sessions that we have, because our gut tells us there's a concept here that's going to start shifting this industry very significantly. And we're interested in what's going to move billions and trillions in net assets in terms of aligning the great talent of this industry to the challenge of the day. I love the way Peter talked about the challenge of removing lead from gasoline once upon a time. Every once in a while, when I see a great accomplishment, I post on my LinkedIn page, please stop telling me what we can't do, okay? Because when we come together unified around a worthy topic, man, I don't know what there is we can't do. So we hope this series brings more experts like we had today to continue to drill down on this worthy topic and move beyond what can be a politicized issue, right? We don't want this to become a right versus left issue, a blue versus red issue. We want it to be a red, white, and blue issue that we come together on to advance our nation for the benefit of the world. So I think we kick this off with a great session, and maybe Lou, you want to talk about the ones that are coming next.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And again, that's well said. We can get this done. It's not beyond the space and satellite industry to accomplish this. And if we've got to take it up and do more with it, we certainly will. Yeah, this, as we said, is going to be something that's going to take place every third Wednesday, thanks to the support that we've been getting for this. Here's a quick snapshot of what you'll see next time. On October 20th, next month, to Hoyt's suggestion, we're going to be looking at governance, both corporate and global, in the areas that he had actually described inadvertently. In an era when the chief purpose officer is a title in a funded department, what does it suggest for the model of the corporation, for the model of entrepreneurship, for the model of employment in the industry? And again, Hoyt gave us a nice starting gun for that discussion. As for governance, as we reach deeper into space, the inevitability of satellite or settlement, I should say, beyond Earth is key. What happens to the shape of national governments at that point? Peter was talking about government enabling. Well, is it going to be governments that are going to enable? How are these things going to get funded? Because most of them will be commercial. So we'll have Dylan George of Voyager Space Holdings with us talking about that, and also Axios reporter Erica Pandy will be among our guests to talk about the chief purpose officer and function. Then in November, we're going to talk about the social factors of the new space economy, and we'll have, among others, Richard Morrison from the Competitive Enterprise Institute to take us through that discussion as well. And finally, at the end of the year, we'll wrap up talking about climate change, and we'll give you more on that as we get closer in terms of who's going to be with us. We are doing a series of podcasts on that around that time as well at SSPI, and we encourage you to listen to those on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the SSPI website. Before we go to questions and I turn it back over to my colleague Jason, I again want to thank the Luxembourg Trade and Investment Office. We appreciate their support, and they have been extremely loyal to our industry. And if you go to Luxembourg, you'll understand why. It is a very, very key industry and one of the thought leaders in this area, as Joe and I will certainly acknowledge. Also want to thank our media partner for this year, Space News. If you haven't read it, their September issue is terrific. Great cover story, SPACs struggling to lift off. And I don't know if Jason wrote that headline, but it's a great one and a great article in there too. The Washington Space Business Roundtable and World Teleport Association are also thanked for their support for our 2021 series. Finally, a shout out to the SSPI team. we don't do anything without these folks. You saw Tamara Bond-Williams help us get up to a good start here. Matt Owen is our producer for this event. Matt is, the guy who really makes it happen behind the scenes. He's unfortunately a Mets fan, but aside from that, he's impeccable in everything that he does. If you'd like to become a member of SSPI, it's $100 a year. We also have corporate support programs, and you can see Tamara about that. We really appreciate you thinking about that. And to my partner, of course, in this venture, Joe Fargnoli from New York Space Alliance. Without his application of the big brain power to this, this really wouldn't happen. So Joe, I hope you're as happy as I am with this and that we're off to a good start.
I certainly am. Our objective is that a rising tide raises all ships. So we want to help advance the industry, and we thank you all for your participation.
And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jason, for some Q&A. And thank you so much for orchestrating that conversation.
Wonderful. And thank you for all that you do and for having put this together as well. It's an incredibly important topic that's only going to get increasingly important as we go forward. I'm looking now in the chat box. I hope I'm looking in the right place, but I don't see too many questions, just one here, but it's an important one. And Peter, you've been singled out for this one, I'm afraid. It's ESG initiatives are not a priority and often not feasible in developing and financially constrained markets. They tend to be focused on social initiatives. A sizable proportion of the emissions reduced in developed countries have simply been outsourced to the new manufacturing economies with favorable policy environments. How are the modern ESG investors addressing this issue to ensure net positive global change is achieved? In other words, isn't ESG just a rich person's acronym?
Well, having visited 50 countries, including developing countries, everything in that question is true. However, I think there's an opportunity to leapfrog better technologies in developing countries, and telecommunications, for example, in solar energy, which has now declined over 90% in cost. So there are some opportunities where in the olden days, you'd export pollution. I don't think that's going to fly going forward. I'm not sure the investors are so much on board. I think the NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are more engaged on that, but I see it coming.
Anyone have anything to add to that point? No. Okay, please do continue to send your questions. I've had some that I didn't get around to asking, and it's something we really didn't touch on yet, and that's the what's going on in the financial markets as it relates to ESG. How does ESG currently affect a company's ability to raise financing, and how is that changing? And I don't know, Hoyt, if you're good for this one.
Well, I think it's just part of the growth opportunity for space in general. If you look at that headline of SPACs trying to take off, there's been 10 or 12 space-related SPACs recently. Some have gone all the way through and acquired their companies. Some have gone public and still haven't yet, finalized the transaction to acquire a company. But a lot of those business plans are things that are going to benefit all of humanity through telecom or data business plans, or just making space infrastructure far more affordable. And I'll just give you one example. One of the hot sectors now is really not so much what can we do in space to directly provide services to the Earth, but what we can do in the space market to grow it, sort of the cislunar market between low Earth orbit and the moon. And there's a lot of emphasis on building infrastructure for manufacturing, whether it's like fiber optics or biotech or pharmaceuticals, real commercial space stations that don't have the problems of ISS in terms of vibrations and humans running around. So we're at that beginning of that age where we're going to start doing new things in space that will benefit humanity. And a lot of these companies, whether they're building lower cost satellites, or they're having lower cost launch vehicles, or they're figuring out how to do space logistics and move things around, or as astroscale, clean up the debris and make sure we don't ruin our own playground. That's a whole new market opportunity. And a lot of the new money flowing in billions of dollars is going after supporting that growth and infrastructure to allow us to do things as crazy as space solar power, which, 5 or 10 years ago, I would have, giggled and laughed at it. But with the way launch cost is coming down, and going back to the moon, and the ability to get some of those resources or mass from the moon, we could see in the lifetimes of some of the people on this call, actual space solar power facilities providing affordable green energy to anywhere on the earth 24/7, regardless of weather or day or night or whatever. I mean, that's now becoming a technical feasibility. And we're doing all the things in space now that would allow something of that magnitude to be created in the following decades. It's not going to happen anytime soon. But think of the environmental impact of low cost, continuous baseload sort of solar energy from space. I mean, that's a huge impact to the environment and society, including the developing world, because you can just as easily beam down solar power from space to developing countries as developed countries. In some cases, probably it's easier.
Lou, I see you on your head there. Anything to add? You have a question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's just so much there. Hoyt always just opens up a can of worms for us. I love talking to him. Actually, this is for each of you, because you all come at it from different perspectives. I think it was Peter who said at one point, this is a collaborative event. Government is going to have to set the rules, and the private sector is going to have to innovate, and let them do it, because they're very good at it. So everybody knows their lane. We all know that. That's kind of almost a cliche, but like a lot of cliches, it happens to be true. The next layer of that, the question that sort of begs itself on that, though, Harriet, Peter, and Hoyt, is, do we need new types of public-private partnerships to get us to these places? Because as Hoyt just said, space-based solar power is inevitable. We may not see it in our lifetimes, I don't know, but these things are all going to occur. But do we need new structures in the PPP area to get them done? And I think that's a worthwhile topic to even explore. But Harriet, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I can jump in. So I guess the space industry is a great example of this, where we typically have very capital intensive projects, right? It's not cheap to get things into space. And so there is always a kind of upfront investment challenge in order to realize the benefits of that space technology. So I think that rings very true for space and the opportunity that public-private partnerships can provide. I think the other area that's interesting is using government as an anchor customer to foster that commercial development and maturity going forward. And something I thought was quite interesting was looking at the video you shared at the beginning of the presentation, where you talked about the government of Norway funding private companies to enable monitoring of deforestation around the world, right? So that's a really interesting example of the collaboration between governments and private companies in order to address some of these issues.
Peter, can I throw that at you and maybe put it within the context of something else you were talking about earlier, which is I think you said that the data is poor, and so if you're going to be building these collaborations, maybe you need better tools, and maybe they're not ready yet. But still, do we need new partnerships? Do they need to evolve in a certain way, in your view?
Well, being a former policymaker and having worked in the private sector since 1988, I'm actually not a big fan of public-private partnerships. There's two different metrics. Bureaucrats are process-oriented. Industry is P&L oriented. It's a different mindset. It's a nice concept. And look, I worked in the mayor's office. I worked for 3 presidents. I've been there, done that. I think the private sector innovates a lot faster. And because you're talking about a fiduciary responsibility, whereas government doesn't really show any fiduciary responsibility. In DC, you'll just print more money. So I'm not a big fan of public-private partnership. Nothing's wrong with the NASA space program. I think it's been a fantastic success. It's spun off 160 industries. It's a fantastic success story. It's unusual. It's really unusual. It's not a one-off. It is a one-off because I don't see that thinking very similar. So we need, unless we're going to get more people from the private sector entering government.
Yeah, but so Peter, I'm going to throw this over to Hoyt. So the Ford Motor Company should have built roads too.
Is that to me?
No,
yeah, that's the Hoyt, and then Peter can go at me again on that one. Yeah.
Well, I both agree and disagree with Peter. In disagreement, I don't think we'd be where we are today without some of the public-private partnerships that came out of NASA to support companies like SpaceX to get commercial cargo and commercial crew. I'm not even sure SpaceX would be here if it weren't for the COT CRS program. So I think, public-private partnerships, if they're done correctly, like I think the COT CRS program was, and that's a rarity, they can be very powerful. And as Harriet mentioned, sometimes what the government just needs to do is be the anchor tenant or first customer. If the government decided to create a strategic space commodity reserve and said, we're going to buy water at L1 and on the moon and whatever, and have a fuel depots, they could start an entire industry just from saying we're going to be this anchor customer. So I think the government has a role, and particularly in space, because as Harriet said, space is hard, right? It's got all the risk of a normal industry, plus you're in space. So it's extremely risky, and you're competing for capital against all those other industries that don't have as much natural risk. So I think there is a role for government. Now, on the other side, one of my favorite quotes was from the CEO of General Electric back at the beginning when NASA was created. He's Ralph Kordinger. And he basically, this was after Sputnik, and we had this space race with the Russians, and we're all afraid we had this technology gap and missile gap. And he basically said about NASA, it's like, this isn't the way we do things in America. And somewhere down the road, we're going to have to unwind this. But for now, there's no other solution than to do this kind of central planning for space. And that's worked great for us. But now we're seeing that unwinding where commercial space is starting to spend far more money than NASA and taking over the leadership. And that's America. That's what we do. And so we're getting back to kind of our roots and how we attack these hard problems, because now we can. Technology has advanced to the point where individuals and corporations can fund this instead of governments.
Yeah, Peter, we're getting back to our roots.
I didn't say government was all bad. I just said that public-private partnerships usually fail outside of the space industry, where NASA has been a great success story. As I mentioned, spun off 160 industries. The solar industry came from NASA, et cetera. But you have to think of the brain power and that's coming in. I work with 7 national labs. They're doing a lot of basic science R&D, which the private sector won't touch. I just think when you start talking about working together, there has to be a common goal, and there has to be some metrics or a roadmap. And that's not what I see a lot of the time. Don't forget, of every government agency, only the Defense Department has a multi-year budget. Everybody else is on a fiscal year, which is ridiculous.
Interesting point.
We're getting some more questions coming in through the chat. This I think can go out to everyone. How important is it for a company or industry to embrace every topic under the ESG umbrella versus whatever are considered the most important ones, like climate change? Does a company fail if it has a great E strategy but no S strategy? So is it all or nothing when it comes to ESG?
It's all or nothing. I'll tell you why. I read a seminar at Baruch College Vertical University, and Bloomberg showed that Volkswagen got an A on ESG, and this is during Dieselgate, where they lied about the cheater chip. So you have to look at the whole system, and that's where the metrics flopped, because it's still, with the Bloomberg machine, showed it being a great investment, and they spent about $25 billion cleaning up this mess. So I think you got to do the whole corporation.
And Harriet, we touched on this one earlier about how space sustainability efforts and the conversations going on there are somewhat lagging behind Earth-based sustainability, for lack of a better way of saying that. Must these two ideas remain disconnected like that, or are they kind of spilling into each other and helping to propel the space side forward?
Yeah, I think very much that they don't need to be separate issues at all. And actually, I'd say that the space environmental issue is just an extension of what we think about in terms of environmentalism more generally, right? So really that comes down to getting the space industry away from an ivory tower where we think that space is inherently different as a business and in terms of the way that we do things, and just thinking about it as a platform and a new place that we can do business in the same way, right? So when we're thinking about that environment in which a space-based company is operating, we should use the same principles as a company that is operating from the Earth.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to cut you off there. You had a great line of questioning I might have disrupted. I'm looking for more questions from the chat, but I have another one that I wanted just to kind of put out there if I can, because we talked a lot about the regulatory side of ESG, but also the fact that there is a lack of data at the moment. So I want to ask if the technology is actually there, because ESG is all about data, and space-based data looks like it will really help facilitate that. But it's one thing for satellites to say what is going on in a certain part of the world. It's another to say who is exactly responsible for it, who owns what land, it's just a huge amount of unknowns. And that's going to be an important consideration when we're talking about ESG, I think. Is there much being done on that front, like a Google Earth where you can just point to any place in the map and say this person owns that, or this responsibility, or this entity? I don't know, Peter, if any of the
we're deep in the weeds in this, and land ownership and property rights is a big issue in developing countries. Mm-hmm. And it's not very transparent. And you go into a whole bunch of legacy issues. So yeah, that's kind of a can of worms, because we're dealing with that already on rainforest and biodiversity and REDD+. And who owns the land? Does the government own the land? If you're in a socialist or communist country, who owns the resource? So there's a whole host of issues here. It's not that simple. Getting back to the data, though, I think the data collection is an easier lift, because there's plenty of software engineers that can build arrays and applications to pull data. That's the key to this is data. If you get good, clean, scrubbed data, that's kind of the holy grail here. So that's why I'm seeing a lot of software companies in the last 6 months get funded. I've seen a lot, and I've never seen that before. It's almost like an idea on a napkin, and they're getting funded.
Yeah, I would add to that to me, it's not so much the data as the commodity, because we're already collecting 100 times more data than we're actually using. Because right now it's humans trying to turn that data into useful information. So the funding of all these software companies is to get machine learning and artificial intelligence and automatic object identification and change detection. Is automating all of these sort of things so we can take these terabytes of data we're collecting every day and create actionable information. So that's going to happen. It's getting very well funded, as Peter mentioned right now. Right now, we're just awash in data that we can't use. We're just throwing it away every day.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Harriet, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, and maybe round it off to say, it's one thing to be able to collect the data, but you've got to be able to do something useful with it, right? Yeah. And so that's really where I think the magic happens with being able to consolidate space-based data with other data sources. So how can you combine satellite imagery with land registries? How can you combine satellite data with, insurance data? It's about being able to bring together those different data sets to really be able to do something useful.
Yeah, it's quite the task. Lou, sorry, I think you have a question.
Yeah, I do, Jason. And again, I wanted to pick up on, where everybody has sort of been touching on, but, it has terrific, I think, global economic power, and maybe a little underexplored at this point. And, Peter, maybe even a role for government, local, national, state departments and like that. And that is that because this industry is expanding so quickly, and we're going into so many different industries that heretofore weren't part of the space and satellite industry, is it possible that we will see places like, where Joe and I grew up in upstate New York, which had a significant industrial legacy, but then had a post-industrial age hangover, be revived again because there is investment, the universities are beginning to become activated, groups like the Environmental Defense Fund are putting up satellites to track methane emissions. Will this have a percolating effect in parts of our economy, in nations that may be somewhat underdeveloped now, and give those economies a lift because it is going to expand so significantly?
I believe so. And I think in the last 18 months with COVID, where people have been working at home, a lot of them are not going to go back to the big office. So I think there's an opportunity to revitalize a lot of communities because of human capital being available. Basically, you can live where you want to work, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Harriet or Hoyt, any comment on that? Is that something that's on your radar or you've thought about?
Nothing there.
Okay.
I'm going to interject just very briefly. We are at 1:26. We're closing out at 1:30, and Zoom tends to be really abrupt. So I want to give everybody a real fair warning that we will be shutting down at 1:30. But if there are any last minute questions, this would be the time. We've got 4 minutes.
Hey, Lou, I've got a question. Why should I give up my lunch hour on those days in October, November, and December? What's so special about those 3 sessions?
Well, because you're going to see more of the same, Joe. You're going to see, great speakers like this. And again, we're going to be talking about the ES and G, which, evidently is the important part. But the next one is going to be governance, and I think that's an enormous topic to bite off. Again, we're as you can see today, we've explored this issue in ways that I go to a lot of conferences, as does everybody else, that I've not heard before. And I commend Jason for that, and also our speakers. But we're going to be doing a deep dive into this, and we're going to really see where we're headed. And so if you're in business, if you're in government, if you're in any sector that relates to our industry, this is new territory, and I think it's also a very exciting conversation. To answer your question, and also Tamara will be singing at the end of each future session, bringing the choir in.
You may not like that too much, but I'm happy to do it.
I know we'll like it. Jason, thanks. Jason, thanks again for that. And if anybody's interested, as I said, in the videos that you saw today, we have dozens of them, thanks to our corporate members. You can go to bettersatelliteworld.com, pull them down, use them for your own presentations. If you're in the media or any other, an educator, those things are available for free. And that's part of our mission, to make sure that we change the narrative of this industry and let people know that we make the world a better place every single moment of the day, as our 3 speakers have demonstrated today.
Well, one last thanks to Jason and our panelists, and to the great team at SSPI. We thank you guys for attending. We think this is going to be a huge topic, and we're going to look back a couple of years from now, very thankful for the great knowledge that these experts have bestowed on us. So we look forward to your attendance at the next session.
Yeah, and I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. I mean, we know you've got a lot of choices at this time of day, and you chose to be with us. So we hope you come back and stay part of our family. And thanks again, Jason, and thanks to Space News.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Everyone.